rolled the same pitch in relation to Matthew Doyle as he did with Peter Mandelson, that they weren't clear with him. He appears to be the most gullible former Director of Public Prosecutions in history. But he has a slight problem, Mr. Speaker, because some of us do read the newspapers. And towards the end of last year, indeed on the 30th of December, having written to the House of Lords Appointments Commission, I received a response from the Chair, who advised me that as part of their vetting, they provide confidential advice to the Prime Minister on the propriety of...
What's your take on this exchange? Drop your opinion in the comments and join the debate below. Who do you think made the stronger point?
A potential... Will he release that advice?
He knows how the system works. But, Mr. Speaker, he says he reads the newspapers. He will have read that in 9 days their former party chief executive goes on trial for embezzling money. And if he'll have read that the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, we see one of the worst failures in Scottish public life. Vulnerable children and adults put at risk. Evidence of serious warnings to the SNP government were ignored. He should have been looking at those, not looking at the newspapers. The First Minister should act because families deserve accountability.
The exchange in the UK Parliament opens with Stephen Flynn directly challenging the Prime Minister on what he presents as a contradiction in the government's handling of political vetting and confidential advisory processes. Flynn does not ease into the discussion or soften the framing. He immediately questions credibility, suggesting that the Prime Minister is either being misled or deliberately avoiding transparency on sensitive appointments. The focus quickly narrows onto a specific point: correspondence from the House of Lords Appointments Commission. Flynn highlights that, as part of its vetting process, the Commission provides confidential advice to the Prime Minister regarding the propriety of potential nominees. From this, he builds a direct demand. If such advice exists and plays a role in decision-making, then why should it not be released? The question is not presented as theoretical. It is framed as a matter of accountability and public trust placed directly at the feet of the Prime Minister. At this stage, the atmosphere in the chamber shifts. The Prime Minister responds, but not in the way Flynn is attempting to force the conversation. Instead of addressing the specific request regarding disclosure of advisory material, he leans into a broader political defense. He states that Flynn understands how the system works, implying that the procedures being questioned are already established and accepted within government practice. However, the response quickly moves away from the central issue. The Prime Minister redirects attention toward unrelated political matters, referencing ongoing controversies, public sector failures, and legal proceedings involving opposition figures and institutions. The tone becomes less procedural and more political. What began as a narrow question about transparency in appointments expands into a wider political confrontation, where accusations and counter-narratives begin to replace direct answers. Flynn attempts to maintain focus on the original issue, but the structure of the exchange begins to shift under parliamentary pressure. As the questioning continues, procedural boundaries are introduced. The Speaker intervenes, reminding members of restrictions regarding live legal matters and ongoing cases. This procedural correction interrupts the flow of the exchange and limits further direct discussion on certain referenced issues. As a result, the immediate line of questioning is partially constrained, and the chamber moves away from a direct confrontation on the advisory disclosure itself. However, the political significance of the moment does not disappear with the procedural intervention. Instead, it becomes more pronounced precisely because the central question remains unresolved. Flynn's argument rests on a simple but politically sensitive point. If confidential advice is being provided to the Prime Minister on appointments, then the question of whether it should be disclosed becomes a matter of democratic accountability. The refusal or avoidance of a direct answer, combined with a shift toward broader political criticism, creates a perception of deflection rather than resolution. The Prime Minister's response strategy becomes a key focus of interpretation. By redirecting attention toward other political issues rather than addressing the specific request for release of advisory material, the exchange opens itself to competing narratives. Supporters of the government may interpret this as a refusal to engage with politically motivated questioning or an attempt to avoid compromising established confidentiality protocols. Critics, however, frame the same moment differently, viewing the lack of direct response as avoidance of transparency on a matter involving public appointments and ministerial judgment. As the exchange develops, the contrast between the two positions becomes more visible. On one side, Flynn presses for disclosure and clarity on how advisory processes influence decisions at the highest level of government. On the other, the Prime Minister emphasizes procedural understanding and shifts the discussion toward broader political context rather than specific documentation. The result is not a clear resolution, but a layered confrontation where the original question becomes absorbed into wider political argumentation. The Speaker's reminder about sub judice restrictions ultimately brings a procedural boundary to the discussion, cutting off further direct engagement on certain aspects of the exchange. This does not resolve the underlying issue raised by Flynn. It simply limits how far the conversation can continue within that formal setting. The most critical question, whether confidential advice provided to the Prime Minister will be released, remains unanswered in the chamber at that moment. What remains instead is a political snapshot defined by tension between transparency and procedure. Flynn's intervention places pressure on the government to justify secrecy in advisory processes, while the Prime Minister's response reflects a broader defensive posture, relying on system knowledge and political counterpoints rather than direct disclosure. The interruption by parliamentary procedure ensures that the issue is not fully resolved on record, leaving space for continued political debate outside the chamber. In the end, the significance of the exchange lies not in a decisive conclusion, but in the unanswered demand at its center. A request for transparency meets institutional resistance, political deflection, and procedural limitation all at once. And within that intersection, the question raised by Flynn continues to linger. If confidential advice exists at the heart of appointment decisions, how much of it should remain behind closed doors, and how much belongs in the public domain?